It feels like every few months, we're right back here again. The US government is on the verge of a shutdown. But what does that headline actually mean for you, for your wallet, and for your day-to-day life? Let's break it all down. So let's just get right into it. From your investment portfolio to your travel plans, what really happens when the government, closes its doors? We are going to cover the real-world impacts, the stuff that actually matters to you. First up, let's talk money, the financial stakes. Because whenever shutdown talk heats up, the first question on everybody's mind is usually about their investments and the market. So how worried should you actually be? Okay, so here's the key contrast you really need to get. In the short term, yeah, for sure, expect some choppiness in the market. Investor sentiment gets pretty rattled, especially if a shutdown messes with the Federal Reserve's plans for interest rates. But, and this is a big but, if you look at the long term, history tells us that shutdowns just don't typically cause these huge, sustained market meltdowns.
Now, get this. During the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, which was back in late 2018 and early 2019, the stock market actually went up by about 10%. I know, it sounds totally backward, right? But investors pretty much just shrugged it off and focused on the bigger economic picture instead of all the political drama coming out of Washington.
All right, so let's shift gears. We're moving from Wall Street to your street. How does a shutdown actually affect your daily life and the services you count on? So what keeps running and what's at risk? Well, it all boils down to what the government considers essential. On one side of the ledger, you've got the services that are legally required to keep going no matter what. And on the other, you've got services that rely on annual funding, and those can get put on pause. So let's be crystal clear about what is not going to stop. Think about things that are absolutely critical for national security and public safety. The military and law enforcement, they stay on the job. The Postal Service, they keep delivering the mail. And those crucial payments like Social Security and Medicare, yep, those will still go out. But here is where you might actually feel the pinch. Planning a trip? Well, you could be looking at much longer airport security lines if TSA agents who are forced to work without pay start calling out sick. And for the millions of people who rely on food assistance, SNAP benefits are only guaranteed for about 30 days. After that, the funding gets really uncertain. Okay, now let's zoom out a bit. Let's go from the individual impact to the entire economy. A shutdown isn't just an inconvenience. It comes with a very real economic price tag. When you're talking about economic damage, there is one factor that matters more than anything else: duration. How long does it last? A shutdown for a few days is like a blip, a minor disruption. But one that drags on for weeks, that can cause some serious pain because federal paychecks stop flowing and consumer spending can grind to a halt.
And listen, this is not just a Washington, D.C. problem. Not at all. The economic pain spreads all across the country. States like California, Texas, Florida, and Georgia have massive numbers of federal workers. This chart right here really shows you how that impact is spread out, with these key states feeling a huge economic hit from furloughed employees and paused federal contracts. I mean, just think about the human cost here. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that as many as 750,000 federal workers could be furloughed. That means they get sent home without a paycheck, creating instant financial hardship for 750,000 families. And when all those workers don't get paid, it adds up to this absolutely staggering figure, $400 million. That's in lost wages per day. And that's money that isn't being spent at local grocery stores, at restaurants, at small businesses, creating this painful ripple effect that spreads throughout the whole economy. So, we've covered the what, now let's dig into the why. What is actually happening behind the scenes in Washington that keeps spraying us to the brink?
This quote from analyst Brian Gardner really gives us a peek behind the political curtain. While the public statements can be really tough and uncompromising, he's suggesting that privately, lawmakers are getting pretty nervous. They know that voters often blame the party in power for these kinds of disruptions, and nobody wants to take the fall for the economic damage. So how do they kick the can down the road and avoid a shutdown? Well, one of the main tools is something called a stopgap funding bill. It's basically a temporary patch. It keeps the government open and just buys everyone a little more time to negotiate. And the pressure to pass one is definitely building. In a recent procedural vote, a few Democrats even crossed party lines, which is a big signal that there's a growing desire to find a compromise and just avoid a crisis. And of course, looming over all of this is the political calendar. For some of these lawmakers, those upcoming elections are a massive factor.
Moderates in particular, who are facing tough re-election races in 2026, they really worry that voters are going to punish them at the ballot box for a messy, disruptive, and lengthy shutdown.
So what could a final compromise even look like? Well, it's a game of give and take. Reversing recent Medicaid cuts, that's probably off the table. But a deal might be possible on extending subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. And why's that? Because some Republicans are very nervous about getting blamed if voters see their insurance premiums suddenly skyrocket right before an election.
Okay, so as we start to wrap this up, let's look ahead. What are the key things you should be watching for as this whole situation plays out?
First, keep an eye on the market's reaction. Right now, there isn't a lot of fear priced in, which tells us that most investors are betting on a resolution. But that also means if a deal gets struck quickly, we could see what's called a relief rally, as all that lingering uncertainty finally gets cleared away. Next up, what about this threat of permanent job cuts? The administration has kind of floated the idea, but is it a real risk? Well, most analysts see it as a negotiating tactic more than anything. While you can never say never, cuts that deep would start to seriously damage the government's ability to actually function. And finally, it's really important to see this shutdown fight not just as some isolated event, but as part of a much larger shift in how policy is being made these days.
To wrap this whole thing up, I want to leave you with this one thought from analyst Brian Gardner. Now, he was originally talking about trade policy, but his point applies perfectly here. Think about it. Both shutdowns and tariffs used to be seen as these extreme last resort measures, but now they're becoming much more common tools used as leverage in big political fights. The big takeaway here is that the old rules of Washington really do seem to be changing, and understanding this new, more disruptive playbook is more important than ever. Thanks for tuning in.
You hear about it on the news all the time, right? The threat of a government shutdown. And usually the conversation is all about the politics. But for hundreds of thousands of people, it boils down to a much more terrifying question. Am I going to get paid? So in this explainer, we're going to cut right through all that noise and get to the financial reality.
Because the answer here is not as simple as you'd think. It really reveals this clear hierarchy of financial pain. Some people get what's basically an IOU, while others are just left holding an empty bag. So who gets made whole, and who ends up taking a permanent loss?
So, let's start with the group that gets all the attention, federal workers. For them, a shutdown is, no doubt, incredibly stressful, but the financial hit is usually, and that's the key word here, usually, temporary. Now, even within the federal workforce, there's a huge split. On one side, you have your furloughed employees. They're basically told, go home, don't work, and they're put on a temporary, unpaid leave. But on the other side, you have essential employees. Think air traffic controllers, TSA agents, federal law enforcement. They have to show up. But here's the one thing they both have in common. The paychecks stop for everyone.
And this brings us to this really important idea of back pay. For those essential employees who had to work through the whole shutdown, the law is actually on their side. It guarantees they will get paid for that time once everything is back up and running. It's a legal certainty. For the furloughed workers, though, the ones sent home, well, that's a different story. Historically, Congress almost always passes a bill to pay them, too. But see the difference? It's a political tradition, not a legal promise.
And here is a really critical point. Even when that salary finally comes through, the government doesn't reimburse you for all the financial damage that happened while you were waiting. Just imagine the stress. Your mortgage payment goes past due, you get hit with late fees, or maybe you had to put groceries on a high-interest credit card just to feed your family. All those overdraft charges, that extra debt, that's all on you. It is a very real and completely uncompensated financial strain. Okay, now let's move one layer out from the center, because this is where the story changes, dramatically. We're talking about government contractors now, and for them, the loss is almost always permanent. So who are these folks? Well, they aren't direct government employees. They actually work for private companies that have contracts to do, everything, from managing IT networks and providing security to cleaning the federal buildings or staffing the cafeterias. When those government offices shut their doors, so does their ability to do their job and get paid for it. And this quote right here just gets to the cold, hard truth of it. Unlike federal employees, there is no political tradition, and there's certainly no law that gives back pay to contractors. The money that they and their companies lose during a shutdown, it's just gone. Poof, forever. They have to absorb the entire loss. This slide puts it in really stark terms. For a federal worker, a missed paycheck is like an IOU from the government. I mean, yeah, it's incredibly stressful, but you fully expect you're going to cash it in later. For a contractor, it's like having a ticket to a concert that got canceled. There are no refunds, it's just a torn-up ticket.
But the financial pain doesn't stop there, not even close. The shutdown creates this massive ripple effects that spreads out through the wider economy, and it causes all this damage that's, well, it's mostly unseen and almost entirely uncompensated.
It all kicks off with one simple, brutal fact. Hundreds of thousands of people, often living in the same city or the same region, suddenly have their income totally cut off.
So what's the immediate consequence? Well, that little sandwich shop that counts on the lunch rush from the federal building across the street, it's now totally empty. The dry cleaners, the local hardware store, that family diner, they all lose their customers overnight. And here's the thing. Unlike a federal salary that could be paid back later, the money that cafe didn't make on Tuesday is gone for good. The owner can't just go back in time and resell those sandwiches, right? That revenue has completely vanished. And the list of victims just goes on and on. Think about the tourism industry. When the national parks are all shuttered, the hotels, the tour guides, all the small towns that depend on those visitors, they suffer these devastating losses. Even investors feel it, because the uncertainty of a long shutdown can create a ton of market volatility, wiping out value from retirement accounts. And none of this ever gets paid back. So, what does this all add up to? The Congressional Budget Office actually put a number on just one recent shutdown, the one back in 2018-2019. It lasted 35 days, and they estimate it erased 11 times billion dollars from the U.S. economy. Not delayed, not pushed around, just erased. That is a staggering, permanent loss. So, let's bring it all together and go back to our original question and answer it directly. When you look at all these different groups side by side, who actually gets their money back? Here's the final tally.
This table just makes it crystal clear. Furloughed federal workers, they almost always get back pay because Congress passes a bill. Essential workers, they are guaranteed it by law. But what about federal contractors? Almost never. And the local business owners who lost weeks of revenue? Absolutely not. No chance.
So, here is the real bottom line. The public conversation, it often just ends when federal employees get their back pay. It looks like things are back to normal. But that hides a much bigger, much harsher truth. For contractors, for small businesses, and for the economy as a whole, the vast majority of the financial damage is permanent.
And that leaves us with one last question to think about. We can measure the lost GDP in the billions, sure, but when you really account for the personal debt, the businesses that failed, the shattered financial security for so many people who never ever get that money back, what is the true, unrecoverable cost of a government shutdown?